Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we have Jacob Stern on the podcast. Jacob is a soon-to-be rabbi at Yeshiva University in New York and is also pursuing a PhD in mathematical logic at the CUNY Graduate Center. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Rabbi Levine.
So for those who have zero knowledge about what mathematical logic is, can you just give the Spark Notes version?
Yeah, so the quicker version of saying it is definitely I'm on the border of mathematics and philosophy. To the layperson, that means something like proof theory, like what is the nature of a proof, or the epistemology of mathematics. How do we know that mathematical truths are true, or how can we be confident in that what we're asserting can be asserted in a reasonable and consistent way?
Can you give like a basic example? Like if you're teaching the freshman class at a mathematical logic, I forgot to add in your bio, you also frequently teach classes at both Yeshiva University and Stern College. If I'm a college freshman and I'm taking your sort of intro to mathematical logic class, I mean, what's your baseline example of
So I think the famous example comes from Russell's paradox, being the barber who shaves all who do not shave themselves, which is a classic example in mathematics of a kind of diagonal argument where you kind of want to claim that all sentences work in a certain way and you end up with a problem. Probably the easier problem is known as the liar's paradox, which is something that I think middle school children have toyed around with trying to deal with. This sentence is false. There's a lot to do with that because from the fact that this sentence is false exists, you have to claim that in logic, not every sentence is universally true or false, and deal with the consequences therein. Because otherwise, if this sentence is false is true, then it's false, and if it's false, then it's true. Known as the liar's paradox. Examples of diagonal arguments, they're called, and these form the basics and backbone of so much of mathematical logic.
Is there any sense? I mean, I'm sort of just spitballing here, and this is going to be fun
Yeah.
because this is not a topic I know anything about. Just for background, I was an applied math major for about one quarter at UCLA about 12 years ago, and I very quickly switched out when I realized I was not able to keep up with people that had been learning calculus since ninth grade. Is this to what extent is that a question of logic and just a question of sort of the inability of language to actually capture truths, right? Because there is sort of a linguistic argument, or a la Wittgenstein and all of that, just saying, language is just an imprecise tool to capture truths. Obviously, we can take this back to, Maimonides and, his famous, line about you not even being able to give God any positive attributes because it is ipso facto incorrect because words are, bound in, finitude and God is infinite. So to what extent, I mean, if I say this sentence is false, that might not be, or at least how I tend to understand it is, that's not a philosophic paradox. That's just exposing language for what it is. Just, you can't ever actually get to pure truth with language.
So this definitely was a common philosophy for time immemorial and dealing with this paradox. The problem is Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and to an extent Russell's paradox in the early 20th century. Gödel kind of proved that you can kind of do the same thing with numbers. And if you take as a given that the numbers exist in some kind of sense and addition is well defined and multiplication is well defined, kind of behaves the way you will, you can kind of build up this liar sentence in a different kind of way within mathematics using something called the Gödel coding. And you end up with purely semantic, like there's no syntactic problem, there's no language involved, there's no anything, just pure semantic paradox from here. And you end up proving things like there's statements about the natural numbers which aren't provable.
Interesting. Okay, one more, college. I feel like this is like a college dorm question. All the questions that people discuss at 2 a.m. just throwing at you, and then we'll discuss questions of Judaism and where that fits in with logic and philosophy. If we take a big step back, there's sort of this meta debate within mathematics. Is math real or invented? I'll try to summarize it, and you can tell me if this is good or not. This is based off my memory from reading a couple books, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. But one theory is that there actually is such a thing as math that's sort of built into the universe that has nothing to do with human perception, nothing to do with our minds and being able to discover it. And it's almost sort of, it's out there, and if we get the right tools and the right theorems, we can then tap into it and discover it. There was a flip argument that says that actually humans invent math. I've never really understood that second view, because if it works, meaning 3 plus 3 is going to be 6 regardless of whether or not humans exist. So one, can you just touch on that debate? Did I do a good job explaining it? And can you try to defend, even if you don't agree, the second view and at least explain it?
Yeah, so I think there's two kind of debates here. I think you're more focused on the first being, is mathematics invented or discovered, versus there is another debate of like, does mathematics actually exist, and is a related but separate debate that you could, you know, have different opinions on. Does mathematics exist, or is it some type of fiction?
So let's start with the exist. What does it mean to say it's a fiction, given that it clearly works? Meaning, if I give any word problem, if I have three companies and each of those companies is making $20 a week, I'm making $60 a week because of multiplication. That's not a fiction. So at what point could it veer into being a fiction?
The point of fiction would merely just be there's no such thing as 60. You can have three companies, but you can't have three. Have you ever gone out into the wild and encountered a 7 trying to eat a 9, as it were? As the old adage goes.
Interesting.
So there's no that would be kind of the fictitious. There's also the in-between opinion that it describes reality, right? 3 is an adjective. I can have a triple of something. That 3 is an adjective. Is kind of the middle ground, I think, taken by many people. And the extreme version is that there's some platonic notion of 3 that really does exist in some true sense.
And
The
is there
other part,
any practical? I mean, in the yeshiva world, just for listeners, I'll teach them a new term, a nafkamina, which is, in yeshiva, if you're talking about these abstract ideas, and somebody says, "Well, what's the practical difference?" Is there sort of a nafkamina or a practical difference between? Is there a Platonic, ideal type of 3, or is 3 really just my way of describing? I mean, what hinges on that, or is that just an interesting academic debate?
I would say that there might be distinctions between the various views practically, but it depends on what you consider what are you most convinced by, and what is the evidence for the other thing. So, for example, I forget the exact number of digits of pi, but after a certain number of digits of pi is no longer able to be measured by the physical universe, right? I think after 100 odd what digits, maybe 1,000 digits, definitely a million digits. If I have a circle the size of the universe and divided by its diameter measured in Planck lengths, I can't measure pi more accurately than a million digits in the physical universe. So the fact that we can describe pi beyond those digits, maybe that's evidence for the fact that numbers exist in some platonic sense, and that pi is the ratio between some idealized platonic circle and its diameter, as opposed to any physical circle that I could draw in the universe. Or maybe that's a consequence of that. Maybe it's not evidence to that fact, but a consequence from some other theological note, from some other philosophical notion. I would arrive at the fact that I believe there exists some platonic form of numbers, and therefore digits of pi after the millionth digit have some type of meaning. I don't know which, it depends which of those two things you hold more firmly. What is the practical difference to and what is the proof text to the other?
I see. Okay. So one more, general philosophical question. Then I promise we'll get to Judaism. This is sort of, starting us down the road to Judaism. There's a whole genre of books that try to marry math, philosophy, and I'll also say theology in terms of, I'm thinking of the book, Is God a Mathematician? I'm forgetting who writes it. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a whole host of books that try to basically argue, the proof for God from a fine-tuned universe. This obviously gets into a physics a little bit, but basically, the argument goes, the universe is fundamentally ordered and fundamentally decipherable. And if you left things up to random, the chance of our universe having been, this fine tuned both for life and also for, the creation of carbon based life forms and, all of that, it's sort of, one in a, bajillion. And so therefore, it seems probable that God exists because the fine tuned, it's the more mature version of the, you know, everything needs a creator, and so what created the earth, therefore God, that was popular in medieval and even before that. I'm curious if you can touch on to that, and then we'll sort of talk about more Jewish specific ideas in a minute.
So that actually kind of transitions to exactly what I feel I have to contribute to this conversation, because I, as a philosopher, am not a studier of all things. I study logic, which is the formal form of argument. I don't necessarily know whether to accept or deny any of the claims given, but I can see an argument for what it claims. And I love that you bring that up, because it's one of my favorite things to bring up as far as how do people nature their belief. Have you ever heard, and I'll ask you a question, a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew try to convince someone of their religion by bringing up the fine tuning of the universe, either in the more naive sense of the creator, of everything must be created, so there must be one creator, or in some type of technical fine tuned sense, either with the life, because that has the easy answer of evolution, being able to create something that looks fine-tuned even though it was never fine-tuned, famously Dawkins' puddle argument, or things like eclipses, I think is a better argument, right? That the human experience is not dependent on the existence of eclipses, but that life so happens to spawn in the very short time of human history where the sun and the moon are exactly apart, such that each one can block the other out, either via shadow or directly. So have you ever heard any religious person bring up any of these arguments in favor or support of their religion?
Not in the narrow sense of their religion, definitely in the broader sense of trying to convince somebody why they shouldn't be a skeptic. I mean, I'm reminded, I don't know if this is where you were going, but I'm teaching in the winter a class on medieval Jewish philosophy. So your question reminded me of the beginning of the Kuzari, which, just to explain for listeners, in case you're interested, Judah Halevi, one of the great thinkers of medieval Spanish Jewry, and he wrote this book, The Kuzari, which is this fictional account between a king who has these dreams that he's, believing the right things, but not doing the right things. And then, of course, it almost sounds like a joke. He invites in, the Greek philosopher, the rabbi, the imam, the priest, to all sort of vie for which is the quote unquote best religion. And of course, he opens up with the Greek philosopher because that's what was popular at the time of, medieval Spain. And the philosopher basically said what you said, right? Gives this very universalistic, general sense of, God exists, and, very a la, Aristotle and Plato, the universe must have a creator, and, how would it move if there was nothing moving it, and, blah, blah, blah. And the king says, this is impressive, I even might agree, but this still doesn't tell me, how do I pray on a weekend? So sort of like your question. So the answer is no, right? It's a pretty shallow argument for if you're going to tell me, or I'm going to try to, or we're both, I guess, sort of in the rabbinic field. It seems like you're going to go more towards the academic track. But either way, if somebody asks us, why should I live my life in X, Y, or Z sense? This conversation seems to have nothing to do with that, in my opinion. But that's sort of the short answer.
I would agree that it doesn't have much to do with it, but that doesn't mean I haven't heard it argued.
Oh,
I've heard
sure.
many people.
Yeah,
That's
I
what
mean,
I'm
listen,
asking. Have you heard it argued?
yeah. You had this whole, but in my mind, this is almost the second half before the first half. And what I mean by that is many people today that are at least in the first world, 21st century, reading about the world, are encountering science and logic and philosophy a lot of times before they encounter Judaism. And so if you are a Kiruv rabbi, say you work at Aish or you work at one of these organizations, you almost have to provide the on-ramp into Judaism from philosophy, which has never really been the Jewish point of view, maybe until the Middle Ages, right? It was always Judaism exists as its own thing, and then philosophy and math and logic, those are sort of other things, maybe other disciplines, or maybe they nicely are compatible, or maybe they're antagonistic, but it was never, let me try to prove Judaism through math. This almost seems like something else entirely. It's how do you, if somebody's completely skeptical, or I come onto the podcast and I tell you God does not exist, or I think it's crazy that people believe in God, then I think it's the right time for saying, one of these wider arguments.
So you already kind of preempted a little bit of where I was going to go with this, but I'll first say maybe we have different experiences with people in Kirov. I have heard many people in Kirov attempt to use these arguments. For those also unaware, Kirov is it literally means to bring closer. It's the kind of Jewish missionary work that happens, but it's not really missionary work. We only kind of missionize to other people who are Jewish. So there's not really a Christian general equivalent that I believe of, unless I definitely could be mistaken there. It's not my expertise. I've heard people bring this up. I've heard Muslims bring it up. I've heard Christians bring it up. I've heard Jewish people bring it up. I've heard people of many different faiths try to bring the fine-tuning of argument of the universe as somehow relevant to their individual monotheistic religion. Once again, towards the line of criticism that you have presented, it doesn't really tell me, quote unquote, how to pray over the weekend and on which day of the week should I pray.
And it's also meaning it's just too universalistic, because, it almost seems, yeah, I mean, there's a line in Micha Goodman's biography of the Rambam, or Maimonides, that I'll never forget, which is religion is the biggest threat to God, or maybe it's the opposite. Yeah, no, it was religion is the biggest threat to God. And in it, he sort of goes into Maimonides' worldview of, everything you do in religion, be it the rituals, be it the literature, be it prayers, are all somewhat of a fictitious abstraction from the capital T truth that's God. And that sort of gets into a little bit of maybe my view. I'd be curious to hear what your view is. if you can talk about how this universe needs a creator because of, the fine tuning and all these things, that's all well and good. And maybe you've captured a capital T truth. How do humans, relate to that? That is where you get into a little bit more, in my mind, bottom up creation, human like, ideas and things like that. So it would be hard pressed if I was a Christian missionary to try to use that as an argument. Therefore, you should, read the New Testament. I don't even really see the connection there. It's convenient, and I think it could make you sound really smart if you're going into, missionary work to, come up with all these fancy numbers that, that no one can fact check in real time because I don't know what all these things mean. So yeah.
So I would say like this. My personal opinion, this is kind of like the controversial thing that I'll say, is that it is possible for it to be relevant. And I think secretly everyone kind of, not everyone, I think many people do kind of agree to its relevance, but it kind of requires some controversial assumptions that I think people make without realizing. I think it's actually incredibly relevant in the following sense. I'll give you a bit of a math test to do this. Consider statement J, which is the probabilistic certainty of the truth of Judaism. All the propositional truths that Judaism somehow claims or states or would be required to make Judaism true. Consider the probability that that is true given the fact that there exists a God. And consider its probability of being true given the fact that there does not exist a God. And let's to make this a little more clear, let's take some type of orthodox, not necessarily orthopraxis, orthodox version of Judaism, the claim that there exists a God and that God is involved in the universe and he has a chosen people, kind of traditional, medieval, anything the Rambam might agree to. Once again, Jews generally can't agree to much. I love the famous line. The only thing all Jews can agree on is that there's at most one God. But getting back to the main point, consider the probabilistic certainty and the truth of Orthodox Judaism given there exists a God, and consider the probabilistic certainty of the truth of Judaism given there is no God. Which
So
of those is much more likely?
well, it's infinitely more likely that Judaism's true given that there's a God, because it's a
Correct.
0% chance that there's God, and anything above zero is the sort of infinite. But this is another place, and I'm curious, how I would do in your intro to logic class. This just seems like it's playing around with language, meaning, just going back to Maimonides, because I've been very steeped in Maimonides the last couple of weeks prepping for this course. There's this question: can God create a rock that God can't exist? And, this question could also, belabor philosophers, for, ad nauseum. And Maimonides just says, this question just doesn't make right. He just rejects the whole premise. He just says, this is not a good question. He's, it's like saying, can you make a red that's a green? It's just like, it makes no sense. Or can you make a 2 that's a 3? In his mind, this is equated. And so I would sort of view your question the same way, where, of course, Judaism, for Judaism to be true, let's say there needs to be three things that are true. And for God to exist, there needs to be one thing that is true. And the first one here is this thing. So it's by definition more likely, now, okay, once you've told me that there is a non-physical force in the universe, a belief that I fully subscribe to, then asking, to what extent is that being involved in the day-to-day, which is, sort of a big one for all, revealed religions, and then the Jewish specific one, that time that God specifically revealed themselves or itself, whatever adjective we want to use, was on Har Sinai, 34,000 years ago to Moshe and the Israelites, right? That's another, statement that probably requires more evidence. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm thinking about this the wrong way or.
I mean, I'll ask you the simple follow-up question of consider two people who have beliefs. One believes that the probabilistic certainty of Judaism is 1. And once again, that doesn't necessarily mean Judaism is true. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. You have to be careful. Let's just assume that they have perfect philosophical belief, that they are convinced, not just beyond all reasonable doubt, beyond anything, that number is 1. And consider another person who thinks that number is 0.999999783. Consider these two people.
Okay.
For the first one, a proof of the existence of God is entirely irrelevant, because they already know God exists by their certainty in the existence, in the probabilistic certainty of Judaism. Completely irrelevant to any of their theology. It might be useful as a rhetoric tactic against an atheist, but as far as their personal philosophy is concerned, it is completely irrelevant, because they have to prove Judaism's 100% certainty via some other means anyway, and those means will come along and prove the existence of God.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and I if you're getting annoyed by my continued callbacks to medieval Jewish philosophy, just let me know, and we can skip to the 21st century. I mean, this is essentially Judah Halevi's gripe with philosophy in general, where he said the proof for Judaism comes throughout history and leaving Egypt and wandering in the desert and the mass revelation, not any fancy Greek philosophic arguments for God's existence, even though he might have accepted those, right? Even though he might have said, fine, you're right. God exists because the universe was created and needs a creator, and the universe has motion, which needs, a mover, and all those things. For him, those arguments were sort of irrelevant because you can prove Judaism, at least in his mind, not necessarily in my mind, with history, right? History proves Judaism, not cosmology. And so therefore, why even bother with the cosmology in your, intro to Judaism philosophy textbook?
So definitely, and you could definitely think of this person who has this 100% certainty being the Kuzari. I'll just note that the Kuzari's arguments don't really work for the logician, as the logician doesn't see a difference between an argument from history and an argument from philosophy, in that we merely analyze premises and conclusions via the ways that they're made and the ways that one are drawn from the other, and the same types of arguments are used in both. We don't really, I at least would not see a difference, and I don't think most logicians would kind of separate these fields. But if you want to pick Judah Halevi as being this person, or some Khuzarian type philosopher who has this perfect 100% certainty of the proof of Judaism absent anything else, and that you kind of from there, because Judaism is true, I know God is true, then a proof of the existence of God seems irrelevant to any of my philosophies. However, let's consider another person. Let's consider someone who has not 100% certainty in the truth of Judaism, but 0.999999743% truth on the probabilistic certainty of Judaism. They read the Kuzari arguments and they are almost entirely convinced. They are as convinced of the certainty of Judaism as they are that they aren't a brain in a vat, going into that type of argument, or that the universe wasn't created last Tuesday, as it were. If that person is then presented with an argument for the existence of God, absent anything about Judaism, by your own admittance of the probabilistic certainty of Judaism being true, given there is a God, versus the probabilistic certainty of Judaism being true that there isn't a God, this person, by being presented with something like a fine-tuning argument, actually increases their probabilistic certainty into the truth of Judaism.
Maybe. I would only say maybe because I'm going to guess if somebody's 0.99, whatever number as you said there, that is already incorporating in a proof for the existence of God. Meaning if I meet somebody and they tell me, Rabbi, I'm 99% true that Orthodox Judaism is true. I just, there's some things that I'm skeptical about. Generally, the things that are skeptical about might be, I don't know, the fact that the rabbis have been given the oral tradition to interpret law, not the existence of God, right? If somebody wasn't sure about the existence of God, I don't think they're holding at 99% Judaism's true. I think it might work if you say 20%, right? If you meet somebody and, all the time, I think this is probably the more likely scenario where I'll be talking to students and, there's a whole range of where people are at in their journey, or even not even students. You just bump into people and they say, I don't know, I'm skeptical, right? I generally believe in God because of, insert some fine-tune argument, or it just doesn't make sense for the universe to not have a God. But, I generally maybe think that, Har Sinai happened in some way, but, everything else is like a little bit fuzzy. That might be a more interesting, because if they're agnostic about everything across the board, if you present them firm truth that God exists, it probably increases it a little bit, if that makes sense.
I understand exactly why you would believe that, but this is an example of some of the reasoning you learned in the first semester of logic. You admitted that that if somebody who has probabilistic certainty in the existence of God has a greater belief in the probabilistic certainty of Judaism, given that fact, right? The first question I asked you, what is the probabilistic certainty
but
of Judaism?
It's not necessarily for every individual. I'm saying more generally, right? So there is a positive correlation, or it even ups the chance on average that, say you took, the 7 billion people on Earth and you made them all believe that God exists, right? Beyond a shadow of the doubt, right? All 7 billion people now believe that God exists, because of one of these arguments. The chances of more people coming to find Judaism, I think, shoots way up, right? There'd probably be, 50 million people trying to maybe convert to Judaism once they're proved that there does exist, one singular God who created the universe. but I don't think you can necessarily run it back the other way. I don't think you can take somebody with already a predisposition to believing in Judaism for whatever reasons that they believe, assuming it's philosophic. Of course, I think the other elephant in the room here is that most religious people are not doing what they're doing because of any well thought out philosophic beliefs. This is almost sort of secondary, and I imagine there are a lot of people, mostly somewhat religious, who are listening to this saying, "What the heck are they talking about?" But I think nonetheless they'll find it interesting, right? So I think there's a difference between individual and group, and I'm curious if you disagree with that distinction.
I would probably relatively I would agree in theory. However, that's not the question as we defined it. The question is very simple: is the probabilistic certainty of Judaism being true higher or lower, given that there exists a God? And the answer is higher. I think that's a relatively uncontroversial answer. And so, if someone doesn't have perfect certainty in the truth of Judaism, then a further proof to the existence of God would increase their probabilistic certainty. The only thing that the point that you made, which is very valid, I think could get you out of here, is let's say you have a person who is 100% certain to the existence of God, but not 100% certain to the probabilistic certainty of Judaism. I don't find those people in full in general, but someone like that, obviously, right? If someone believes in God, then another proof to the existence of God wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah, that's sort
But
of where I was going with the 99% person,
right,
right? Because I'm going to imagine if somebody believes in Judaism 99%, that has to presuppose an existence of God. Otherwise, I just don't know where they're getting that certainty from.
generally, people who believe in things not 0.99999 per 0.847% generally have very deep philosophical problems, because you don't get to that certainty of anything without like that I would personally, to get into my own work, I believe that like 3 + 2 = 5 with that degree of certainty. I don't believe in anything with a higher certainty than 0.999999784 or something like that. The
Sure.
universe was created last week. So if you have someone who's telling you that they believe something with 99 with 0.99998% probabilistic certainty, the odds are that all of their premises have some degree of uncertainty. If that is not the case, right, you might have someone like Descartes walk into the room and disagree with some of this, but for the most part. So my main point, however, is just to argue that I think more people than either is realized by anyone or realized by themselves argue probabilistically and not holistically, because I'll get back to like the core of my argument, and you can agree with it, you can disagree with it. It's very much inspired by the work of David Johnson, one of my professors at Yeshiva University. That if you take the assumption that the probabilistic certainty of Judaism being true is greater given there exists a God than there does not exist a God, and you take the fact that there are people who somehow incorporate a proof of a creator with their Judaism, as they have an increase in a certainty in Judaism, given that there exists a creator, it must be that their arguments are probabilistic in nature and not
Mm.
certain in nature. Now, you might claim that, okay, is this not just the language semantics that we were discussing earlier? But I think it leads to a really powerful point when it comes to arguments of religion, which is sometimes religious people are frustrated when they're discussing with an atheist, and the atheist brings up the same points. The atheist experience on YouTube is kind of famous for this. Any religious person calls in, they go immediately to the lack of historicity of the Bible, and they go to slavery, and they go, I will not suffer a woman to teach. And they go to theodicy, right? Tzaddik v'Ra'la, why do good things happen to bad people? If you're a religious person who has 100% probabilistic certainty, right, that number is 1. You have to have a perfect answer to any question asked. However, if your belief is 0.999999874, then you can concede a point to an atheist. You can say, given if the only evidence I would have for God, if the only part of the Torah that would have been given was the parts discussing slavery, I would agree with you. It's all nonsense. It's made up. I don't have an answer for it. There's no chance of Judaism being true. However, given that there is more evidence to that, we can argue probabilistically on the rest of it. I can concede a point. I can concede that if the only evidence I had to discuss about God was theodicy and the problem of evil in the world, then yeah, I probably wouldn't believe in a God. However, I have all these other proofs and all this other evidence in other ways. And therefore, the fact that you have pointed out one way in which my argument is weaker does not diminish the fact that I have an argument.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think there are some points being skipped. I mean, so let's take a bunch of steps back. Let's start
Yeah.
with, in your mind, the sort of easy one, and then we'll go to the hard one, right? The easy one is the existence of God. I mean, do you think, as somebody who studies, the intersection of all this, I mean, do you think that there is convincing proof for God given what we know about math, logic, philosophy, all of those things? And when I say God, I don't mean a God that you'll
Mhm.
read about in any, book that was written hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. I mean, something that's an immaterial force that, animates the universe in some way.
So my personal belief irrelevant here. I'm not trying to make an argument about my personal belief and trying to evangelize anyone. The only thing that I'm trying to evangelize anyone to is epistemological philosophy and having a better idea of where people's beliefs come from and how to argue about them as opposed to anything else. But let's concede for the point. Let's talk about someone who is in my shoes who believes in a God in Judaism
Hmm.
and any of the
A
points therein, whatever
hypothetical
you
person named Jacob Stern on a hypothetical
right,
podcast being asked a hypothetical
right,
question about the.
right, right. Or to quote, I think the best argument for the existence of God is was it Gödel? It's the modal proof for God, which is very technical in modal logic. And to quote once again Professor David Johnson, I can write it on the board for you. I'm convinced of the truth of this argument, but I'm not really sure what it says.
Mm.
I'm convinced that every step follows from the prior. I'm convinced that the assumptions are true, but the conclusion seems to be there exists a God. I'm not really sure if that's what the conclusion states.
Well, that's like I'm forgetting what the name is. There was once a time where I was deeply engrossed in these philosophic arguments for God, but the idea of, think about the greatest being that you can possibly conceive of,
Right,
you know,
Anselm's argument.
yeah, the Anselm's argument, right? If you think, just for listeners to spell this out, right? Imagine the greatest possible, force you can possibly imagine, right? Now, given if you accept as a premise that existing is greater in some way than non-existence, then that greatest possible force you can possibly conceive of must exist, because if it didn't exist, it would not be the greatest possible force you can possibly conceive of. So therefore, you've now displayed there has to be a greatest force, and that greatest force must exist. Ergo, you've, proved God, right? So that argument also holds, but I don't think that will convince anybody who's not already believing in God, right?
Right,
It's just a clever,
right,
playing with words there.
right. So let's take your premise, the theoretical person who believes in God, whose name is Jacob Stern, is on a Zoom call with you.
Yes. So that person, I mean, I mean, or we can even make this, more personal to listeners. I imagine most people listening to this, probably there's a wide spectrum, right? It's mostly Jews, although there are some, loyal non-Jewish listening fans. I mean, almost everybody that listens to this is probably at some point in their life critically engaged with this question: is there a God? Is there not? Some of them have probably landed on, different sides of that debate. But what can, I mean, the field of mathematics writ large and the field of, modern philosophy and logic, I mean, what can it tell them to, in your words, to weight their probability more so on one side or the other?
It doesn't tell you anything about how to weight that probability, or if you accept certain like kind of clever arguments like the modal argument, then I think it gives you an answer. But my point is merely the type of analysis that I just presented to you, the kind of accidentally prove that people argue probabilistically, right? I'm relatively convinced by this. I believe more people argue probabilistically than they think about, and therefore,
But this is obviously true, meaning, like, I mean, I guess, I mean, I don't mean to say that this is so shallow, so it might come across. I'm just thinking about any belief that I hold strongly. You know, I believe that, you know, X, Y, and Z policies would be better for the country. Therefore, I vote for X politician. That's for sure a probabilistic. I mean, I don't know anything about, all of the different configurations in the universe given higher minimum wage or lower. I have assumptions that I make. And so, if somebody asked me, or even voting, I mean,
mhm,
I was,
I
on
would-
the fence about how to vote for a number of people this past election, given a whole host of things that I care about. Israel, obviously, anti-Semitism, the economy, immigration, women's reproductive freedom, right? Sometimes politicians did not hit all these buckets. And so it was okay, I'll vote for this person because probably I think they'll be better on the whole host of ranges. I actually can't think of anything in life I do given certainty. I mean, even more concrete things, I love my wife and I think that we are, in love, right? Even that, again, that is presupposing, that one, we're not brains in the vats, that, there's something that exists outside of my head that presupposes there is this idea of love that's not just a bunch of neurotransmitters, firing in funny, rhythms from some, alien overlord, pressing buttons on a piece of paper, right? I mean, like, and again, 0.999, 83, whatever you said, but, I think it's almost taken, yeah, it just seems kind of obvious that anytime
I
someone
mean,
makes a concrete statement, it's
what would you say about 2 + 3 = 5?
so that probably hinges on this debate about whether or not numbers are real or made up or some sense. If numbers are made up,
So,
meaning
ignore the numeral aspect of that. Take a simple theorem of logic, modus ponens. Assume P implies Q, therefore Q. How certain are you to that statement being true? That is like the
so
most basic fundamental law of logic.
so there I think I would say 100%. But I think
Well, to
that's
some
because it's
people, belief in a god is of that level of modus ponens and whatever. Like, look at Descartes. Descartes is uncertain as to like whether mathematical truths exist because like to do mathematics, I kind of have to remember something I've prior proved, whatever. But seems to be entirely convinced that like not even assuming the existence of senses being sensory information being evident that a god can exist. So you have people who claim that existence of God isn't probabilistic, even though things like today is Monday is.
yeah, it just seems like that's a misalignment in some sense, meaning, when you have abstract logic principles, that's different than when you're applying it to things that are necessarily going to be dynamic, right? I mean, I don't know, like if you say, yeah, once you try to define P or Q by something that's a little bit dynamic, it just seems to go out the window. I think anybody, there is right. I'm thinking of probably the most famous, midrash or rabbinic teaching that kind of talks about the cosmological, the argument by design, which is, Abraham walking along the road, and there are different versions of this. So I'll just give the simplest one. He sees a house, and the house has a fire on it. Presumably there are people living in it, and he says, okay, there obviously has to be a person there, and probabilistically, it's actually not true, right? There's this, philosophic statement, can monkeys produce Shakespeare, right? If you just start pounding at keys random, do you produce Shakespeare? And the answer, of course, is yes. Given infinite time, you do produce Shakespeare. I see you shaking your head. So but just to finish this thought, and then you could, you can
Mhm.
complicate it. So it seems like if you present me Shakespeare and you said, well, there was this guy Shakespeare that probably wrote this, although we don't have any proof. And also, there's been this experiment of this monkey having been sitting in this lab for the last 10 years, every day just typing at random who produced this. Again, 99, 0.9, zillion times Shakespeare, but I can't know for sure that it wasn't the monkey.
Yeah. Um, I would talk to people about this one because you'd be surprised how many people won't say that. In fact, people have asked, there might be, is there any source in the rabbinic literature that discusses this? And there actually is a source in the rabbinic literature, very possibly, about does belief in Judaism, does kind of like the Orthodox take that belief in a God and the belief in the probabilistic certainty of Judaism, is it able to be, kind of probabilistic or not? And the answer is like, you're obviously not going to find somebody who talks about probabilistic certainties in these exact terms, but there is a statement of Nachmanides in his critiques of the Rambam's enumeration of all the mitzvahs, all the commandments that are given in the Torah. The Rambam quotes a midrash Chazal, quotes a midrash that says that right, what is the work that you can do in your heart? Zuhi tefillah. This is tefillah, and from there the Rambam deduces that there's a once a day commandment to pray. Nachmanides actually argues on this and says that no, that midrash is not pshat. That's not the simple understanding. That's some type of rabbinical attachment, right? The rabbis had this idea of prayer and they attached it to a verse. That's not what the verse originally intended. Rather, the simple explanation of the verse is shalota shum safek believe adam upikpik belivo al avodas habore. I'm forgetting the exact. There shouldn't, but the sense there shouldn't be any doubt or question or any type of thought in the heart that, there isn't a God who rules over all, et cetera, et cetera. I forgot exactly what he kind of includes in there. But that's kind of like the closest thing is you might actually have this discussed in the medieval rabbinic literature of this idea of like how certain you have to be. Now, if I walked up to Nachmanides and I asked him, if somebody believes in the truth of Judaism, 0.999999987, is that considered a suffix belibo? Is that considered a hero? Maybe he would say yes, maybe he would say no. I don't know for sure, but you do have such an idea in the rabbinic literature.
Interesting, but they're probably talking in some way different than these, this is a very modern conversation I think that we're having, because I don't even know. I mean, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, 500 years ago, I think if you went to most Jews and presented them with this, they would just have no idea it's just, almost as if, and I think this is either the good thing or the bad thing about us being in modernity, or what Charles Taylor calls, a secular age. The sort of, the water that we're swimming sort of through is secularity. And then there's this thing called religion that we're engaged with, as opposed to the water we're swimming through being religious, and, secularity doesn't really exist. And in other words, for us, the existence of God is a philosophic theorem or precept or idea that we discuss and abstract. For them, it would have been just taken for granted. Whether or not they had a good reason to take it for granted is aside, but for them, it was almost just, the premise that they were, downloaded in from the time that they were born, 500-600 years ago. So I don't know if they were ever revisiting that constantly philosophically. Obviously you have people that try to prove it, but they were proving it given, this is sort of the big jab at a lot of the big project of why medieval philosophy oftentimes doesn't hold up in 21st century philosophy, because really they were all doing it in a ether of everybody already believing in the existence of God. And so, proving the existence of God when everyone already believes in it is not going to hold up in the sort of court of public opinion once half the people are coming at arguments from, atheism, or, even just this idea, just to spell out for listeners, because I think it might be interesting. I remember the sort of big, okay, so you have the fine tuning, proof for the universe of, all the numbers seem to match up perfectly, and, the levels of gravity and, the levels of all these things, blah, 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 are, perfect for life. And, what, it would have been 1 out of 100 trillion if that, for that to happen in random. The atheist rejoinder is, you're right? It's called the anthropic principle, right? This is what, a lot of notable atheist philosophers argue, and they say, you're right. This is, by nature of us actually being here, we are the 1 out of 10 trillion, and there's 999, whatever, blah, 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 planets out there, or, if you're in the metaverse theory, other universes where it doesn't. But by definition, the fact that we're talking about it means that we just, we won the lottery. And so you don't have to come up with, if you see someone with $100 billion and they tell you won the lottery, you don't need to say, well, how rare is that? No, the guy's there. It is rare, which is why it's so special. So I think a lot of times you just get into these philosophic circles to some extent, which is why I wanted to, your personal, if you don't want to give your personal opinion, I guess I can give you, you can abstract it in some way, but just this question of, me, I will speak personally for a second. There were years where I was just,
before we get to that, would I be able to respond?
Oh, please.
Yeah. So your comment on the medieval philosophy, I think, is very relevant. And when we talk about proofs of God, that's relevant. But sometimes you have the opposite problem, where medieval philosophers are very concerned in the existence of multiple gods. So Nachmanides' original statement might have been interpreted in the way that I want to interpret it, but not in that the other alternative was no God. The other alternative was polytheism. Of you have to believe that there is one God who's the Echad Yachid Yuchad, the creator of the universe, the one alone and singular, etc., etc. As opposed, we would say, take that as opposed to atheism. He was probably trying to say as opposed to polytheism.
Yes, but I'm this is actually, it's funny that you brought that up, because this could take us down a whole tangent, which we could go on if we want. But
right.
The difference in my mind between 2 gods and 1 god is a lot bigger than 1 god to 0 god, in the sense of, especially in the medieval ages, the line between multiple gods and 1 god for some Jewish thinkers, I would put Nachmanides in that, was not as strong as, we might believe it to be. Not that Nachmanides believed in 2 gods, but, he was, sort of, at the sort of early stage of Kabbalah, and he was already dabbling in what's called the 10 Sefirot, these aspects of gods, and he was very much within a wider Christian milieu, who anyway have been spending, 1,000 years at that point playing around with this idea: is God one, is God three, maybe God's both one and God, three, and so for there, it almost sort of was a much more natural spectrum from one to, whatever. And I would argue, a lot of scholars of, ancient Judaism, talk about the same thing. The ancient Canaanites had this whole pantheon, and, El was at the top of the pantheon, and then the Torah, in a lot of ways, just kind of collapses all the gods into one God, whatever, ancient Judaism aside, to go from 1 to 0 of, there is an immaterial force or forces, behind the universe, to no, it's actually all just material and random, and, given enough, I don't know, quantum flux at the beginning of, the universe, it just is. It seems like that's a bigger difference. I'm curious if you would agree to that.
I think let's take everything you said as right. I think you dug yourself deeper in a hole rather than climbed it out.
Perfect.
Because if Nachmanides was so concerned with people believing in a second God, then all the more so he'd be concerned with people believing in no gods, right? If I want to use Nachmanides as some type of evidence that there's some Jewish thinker who thinks that the existence of God needs to be probabilistically certain, and you're saying, well, believing in multiple gods might be different because that might not be as much of like an affront to what was considered Jewish ideas. Once again, with the Sefirot going around in Kabbalah, the Ramban by Azazel is always very fascinating to read through and try to figure out exactly what he thinks is going on there.
Just to spell that out for listeners that might have had, completely lost us by now. The Ramban, medieval Spanish Jewish thinker, also a Kabbalist, also, very steeped in philosophy, has this famous or infamous, essay where on Yom Kippur, one of the things that you do, or that they did in the ancient temple in Jerusalem, was they would take one goat and offer it in the temple, and another one they would, it's very vague language, but they would basically push out into the wilderness. And Nachmanides has this famous or infamous essay where he says, basically, this is to placate this sort of, demon that lurks in the wilderness, and you're sort of placating that demon so that it doesn't prey against the Jewish people in Yom Kippur. And, a lot of Jewish thinkers have really no idea what to make of this. Okay, back to you, Jake.
So anyway, so if Nachmanides was afraid of that, Shalote sum safek belibo, and he was so afraid, and he made it very clear that like Judaism requires the exact belief in one God and not more than one God, and the Echad Yachad Miyuchad, the singular, perfect, and unique God, then all the more so he would have a problem with people, with you're saying, making the bigger jump to the lack of God, and the universe is inherently secular and materialistic.
Oh, right? For sure he wouldn't like it, but I think from a bird's eye perspective, it clearly is what's happening in some sense, meaning it's a lot easier philosophically if you tell me, okay, let's go back to the thought experiment, right? If a God exists, or if some immaterial force exists behind the universe, the chance of it being one thing versus multiple things is a lot smaller than that jump from material to immaterial, right? So once you're telling me, once a philosopher proves that there is an immaterial force in the universe that animates things, call it God. Is that God one? Is that God multiplicity? Is it multiplicity contained in the one? To quote the mystical tradition, right? How can the many come from the one? In sort of the Neoplatonic tradition, where God is simultaneously one and multiplicity and one at the same time, right? This is the entire idea of the 10 Sefirot and Kabbalah, right? I actually really like this sort of, Jewish mystical rabbit hole. It aligns with my beliefs a lot more. But just to go back to the, what I consider to be the dry philosophy for a second, to go from 0 to 1 just still seems like such a bigger jump, because even in sort of just to go back to the the logic of it, and we can see if you feel free to evade the question one more time. I say that half in jest, but from Occam's razor, just to spell it out for listeners, the simplest explanation is generally the best, right? So if I don't know, I see you come home and you have take out food from a sushi restaurant, I should probably believe you just stopped by a sushi restaurant, not, I don't know, a bunch of knights and aliens came by and dropped that in your hand right before you stepped through the door, right? Very obvious, right? It's called Occam's razor, right? Does Occam's razor, right? So there's sort of two different ways to view this. One, if, given what we know about, say, quantum mechanics and physics and all these things, if the universe could have begun and spread out, and life could have been created given just material with all this quantum uncertainty and all these things that we don't really understand anything of yet. Then the insertion of God, basically, goes against Occam's razor. Why are you adding this other thing when we already have sufficient material or sufficient ideas to explain this? If you don't think, right, if you're still left with this question of, okay, well, where did quantum mechanics come from? Where did the material to cause the Big Bang come from, right? Where did all, then you basically need something because you're anyway, postulating some abstract principle, whether that abstract principle is the laws of physics or the abstract principle is, some immaterial force, right? Laws of physics are also an immaterial idea in the universe, right? So then God maybe fits right in. It's like, okay, you have God or you have no God, and it's basically, the same thing, So that, just to go back to that question, I mean, I'm curious if you have thoughts one way or the other there.
So first, thank you for elaborating. I think I've understood what you're saying a little bit better now. The first thing I will say is I think we're agreeing much more than we're disagreeing, but I think what you have said is
this is the prototypical Jewish agreement where we agree, but yeah, we argue about it for 30 minutes anyway.
Right. Your claim is that the philosophical jump from 0 to 1 is a much larger jump than the philosophical jump from 1 to 2.
Yes.
I'm accepting that, first of all, that yes, and I know that makes more difficult any of the work I would like to do, but I'm also noting that statement probably helps me just as far as the fact that it would be then it is not more likely, but then there is no rebuke about this fact that Nachmanides might hold that you have to believe in you might have to believe in a God in order to kind of fit into orthopraxis. Of this idea of the statement of Nachmanides, the fact that Nachmanides was opposing multiple gods as opposed to opposing no God would become irrelevant to his statement because the jump from 1 to 2, and if he thought the jump from 1 to 2 was so big to take you out of orthopraxy, obviously the jump from 1 to 0 would take you out of orthopraxy. I'm stating that sentence in using orthopraxy as well as orthodoxy very specifically. But to your main point, it seems like you're just asking me, does any of the thing that you brought up, the jump from 0 to 1 being so big, in any way make me question the existence of God, correct?
Or even the other way around, meaning there aren't a lot of people, at least to my knowledge, that are engaged in serious study of logic and philosophy, secular logic and philosophy, and Orthodox Jewish belief, right? If you were a Reform rabbi, fine, I'd have no deep questions for you because, not that I don't think Reform rabbis think deeply, but, okay, there's all sorts of, area to be able to maneuver within the Reform worldview, right? Orthodoxy, usually, if I meet an Orthodox rabbi, my assumptions, and, if these assumptions are not true about you, you can either tell me or, silently laugh to yourself, whichever you feel comfortable with. I assume, one, of course, you believe in God. You believe that God revealed, itself to both, starting off Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then Moses at Mount Sinai, mass revelation, that the Torah that we have today is in some way either from God's mouth to Moses' ears or written by God, or some of it was written by God, or at least the general principles, right? There was some interaction between, God and humanity in, Mount Sinai, that the Torah that we have is a divine document. And that's not just, this flowery artistic wordplay of, oh, it's divine because we've made it divine. No. Like, it is divine because God wrote it. And then the, subsequent 2,000 years of rabbinic tradition is in some way based off of that theology where, it holds, and that, in some way we, as, a practicing Jew who wraps tefillin every day and eats kosher and fasts on Yom Kippur, is doing something, objective, capital T truth in the eyes of God, given the, universe that God has set up. That's sort of my base assumption of, orthodoxy. Obviously, there's a lot of, nuance within all of those. We can dig in. Of course, there are these, very fascinating books, Menachem Kellner, do Jews actually have to believe in anything? Putting those aside, even Maimonides would say, no, there are some of these things that are, necessary beliefs in, to participate within a Jewish community. I use the word necessary very, very carefully there. That generally doesn't fit with somebody saying, okay, I'm going to assume nothing's true, right? How I imagine a good philosopher or logician, views the world. And now let's see what I could build up as premises based off of either truth or probability or all these things that you're saying. At at what point do those things come to intersect? And I guess, if you don't want to go personal, for somebody that's at home that's sort of, confused, and there's so many different worldviews out there and they don't really know what to think in terms of their own faith, what can you tell them to at least help weight their thinking a little bit one way or another? I mean, so you can kind of take that question however you want.
So yeah, so I'll say this first. I think one of the questions you're trying to ask me, kind of indirectly, and let me know if this isn't a possibly correct interpretation of your question. I think there's many. How does my work as an academic and my study of logic and philosophy influence my orthodoxy and orthopraxy?
Yes.
So the answer is less than you would imagine, but more than you might think. In that, my personal belief as to whether or not there exists a God, or any of the proofs that anyone know present a good constructive argument to which I would agree, is not my expertise. And like, I don't actually have an expert answer as, a mathematician, a logician, as someone who studies, structures of ordered theories and languages, to that question. However, I have a lot to say about how people talk about it. So as far as the practical, I have a lot of practical things to say, quote unquote, to the viewer at home, as you would say, or I guess the listener at home, given this is a podcast. The example I gave you before is the probabilistic argument of, if you're talking with someone, just because you have a problem, not a problem, but just because you are perturbed about a part of the tradition, a part of kind of this premise of the probabilistic certainty of Judaism, right? Just because you hear an argument that is sufficient against it does not mean you have to, quote unquote, throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? If you're arguing probabilistically, which once again, if you're not comfortable with, I think there's people who do think remotely. You seem to think that more people argue probabilistically. I agree with you that probably people do, but I don't know if they consciously do it. If you're arguing probabilistically, you get to do things like concede. Like, I'll give you a personal belief. I'll give one. I would concede that if the only evidence I had for the existence of God was theodicy, I would definitely say the religious have lost that debate a long time ago. And the atheists, as far as the numerical problem of evil, not having to do with mathematics, just for those unfamiliar, the problem of evil is the existence of even evil in the world, Sadik Viralo, the righteous and bad things happen to them, the wicked prosper. That I think I can deal with. The problem is the numerical problem of evil. That, sure, there might be reasons, free will might lead to something, whatever, but the amount of evil in the world, the amount of suffering by innocent is so great that is heavy evidence against the existence of God. And I accept that. When I do my calculus and when I lay in bed at night pondering the existence of God, that is a check in the W column for the atheists. But that doesn't end the conversation in the way that someone who reasons certainly would.
No,
Someone
but
who
even to
reasons with
get, I mean,
certainty.
sorry if you don't like my, I
Yeah,
guess, continued,
yeah.
narrowing of this question, right? So we established before, right? General questions of God's existence. And then, even let's say the secondary question of God's interaction in the world, right? That's the question of
Mhm.
theodicy. The Orthodox Jewish claim is something much more specific, right? All of a sudden, right, to believe in Orthodox Jewish belief, we're no longer talking about philosophy and logic. We're also now talking about history and archaeology and literature, because a lot of the claims that the Orthodox Jewish tradition makes are implicates these other fields. And so now, right, just in terms of probabilistically, right, like we can sit here and say, okay, the existence of God makes a lot of sense for all these reasons. When we then go to another question, that's say, a little bit more controversial, at least from people coming from an Orthodox worldview, the historicity of the Torah and single authorship of the Torah, all of a sudden there, right? Okay, let's say we, put on our good philosophy, we take off our kippas and we put on our sort of good philosophers hats, and we start to say, okay, let's assume we're agnostic about this question and we're just sort of, looking around and scouring evidence. Okay, so archaeology, right? Okay, archaeology, we give that one to the Bible critics. Literary analysis, okay, that one goes to the Bible critics. History and what we know about, Judea and, ancient Egypt and ancient Assyria and all okay, that goes to the Bible critics. So then we're sort of just left with a tradition versus all these other things. And now, if tradition's enough, like, okay, fine, right? I'm not saying that, if I get up in shul or I go to shul, I don't want my rabbi to give a, a nice drosh or a nice sermon about the different, documentary hypothesis, theories about how it affects, I don't know, Joseph in this week's Parsha, right? I want the nice, traditional, some midrash, some medieval, some modern, wrap it up. So I'm happy engaging in these two different disciplines as separate. But if you wanted to marry those, it seems like the onus of evidence within the Orthodox tradition is just so much higher that's where it seems to, fall off a little bit.
So so I think point number one, as far as like what I can contribute, as far as my expertise, is just if any one of those things you mentioned, right, where it doesn't come pure philosophy like the Odyssey were, but let's say you're a relatively orthodox person, but you're convinced by some of the arguments about biblical criticism, specifically as it comes to Chumash, right? If we're dealing with anything else in the Bible, we have a much easier time than other religions do, because we have a lot of, we have at least 3 books of the Bible that claim in themselves to be written by multiple authors. Um, Even though some religious Jews will tell you that that's not the case, and even those are written by one author. There are 3 books of the Bible that we have claiming multiple authors. So ignoring that for a moment and making sure we're focusing just on Torah, my first claim is that conceding a win to Bible critics and the atheists about the documentary hypothesis and biblical criticism doesn't mean conceding them all, because you can argue probabilistically they have some arguments that work and we have some arguments that work, and then you can weigh them and end up deciding that one side is stronger than the other, as opposed to somebody who reasons certainly once the documentary hypothesis is presented to them, they don't have anything left to say. Your second point is interesting as far as like how much can you concede, right? If I think that the atheists win theodicy and the Bible, and they win as far as the literary analysis of the documentary hypothesis, and they win as far as evolution historicity and like forcing to make more parts of Torah allegorical than anyone had taken prior to the Middle Ages, like if they keep on making these wins and the religious keep on conceding things, as I think is the standard practice in a lot of modern day Orthodox thought, and I don't just mean Orthodox Jewish thought. I mean, you look at the Catholic Church, you look at the various autocephalous churches of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. People are conceding every day more and more points. At what point do we have nothing left, where our claims become vacuous and we're not really trying to argue for something? And I think that is something we have to be concerned about.
If we are, but and this is all in this kind of whole conversation, I just add, just getting into my own philosophy, this is all assuming we want to put religion into the same category as logic and science and all those, as opposed to arts, literature, and those things. Like, I'm very comfortable, at least my own philosophy, viewing religion as, obviously more so then, but of the same qualitative type thing as a very beautiful painting, as opposed to a very well thought out mathematical theorem. I think they just do different things for us. And, it is true to say a painting is beautiful, and it's true to say this mathematical theory is beautiful, but they mean different things. And if I say the Pythagorean theorem is true, right, that's one of the things I remember from, middle school. We'll go there. Probably most listeners are familiar with that. Right. If I say that's true, that is different than I say it is true that, I don't know, Michelangelo was a good painter, and those are just kind of different claims that we're making. And so for me, and again, this gets around all these questions of, when I'm engaging in the religiousness, that just, for me, that's a different realm than when I'm engaging in, put on my, logic or mathematical hat, or, my skeptical hat, that I've sort of put on with this conversation. To me, I've fully separated that. If you want to view them as the same, that's where, at least for me, it just seems to get hard, because I don't see, especially within an Orthodox context, I just don't see a lot of the evidence coming down on the side of Jewish tradition for it to play games in the, math and logic and science category. Not to say that it's lesser than, but it's just not the same thing. It's just, you're accidentally crossing disciplines here.
So I would say I understand exactly why you would want to do that. I understand why people do that, but let's note also that that same argument can be made the other way, and that there's something lost also by treating religion as an art and a literature as opposed to as a science
Oh,
and as a philosophy.
there's totally
Right.
something lost. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So you
No, just
understand why people would
yes,
want
yes,
to
yes.
keep it.
Like you're more right than you know, or maybe
Right.
maybe you do know. Of course there's something lost because the, for religion, okay, let's just pick for I know I'm trying to go, there's so many times in life where you see religious people making the ultimate sacrifice, whether we view that as good or bad for their religious views. That obviously is not coming because they think the religion is a great piece of art, right? That is coming because they think mathematically, philosophically, theologically, all these things, this is true and this is what I must do. I just think, at least from where I'm at, but I would argue, sort of the crux of this conversation in some way is that in the 21st century, that's just, people that are being super thoughtful about this. I'm not talking about, your average person who grows up in a religious tradition and never really questions outside of the bounds of, very defined Overton window. It just seems like it's almost inevitable from some perspective if you want to engage in all these things. And I say this as somebody, I was telling you before the Zoom call, I don't know how much we were going to go into this, but, I figured it's an interesting place to bring it up. For me, growing up in the Orthodox tradition, it was the biblical criticism and that, whole ancient Judaism, studying the history of that shaped my view away from Orthodox Judaism. Not against it, or obviously not against Jewish tradition, which I still love and adore, but just in terms of changing what I meant when I say, the Torah is true, I would still affirm that statement, but now I think it's true the same way that I think, there's truth in the book 1984 without, obviously it would be, if you took a time machine to the year 1984, you wouldn't expect to find, thought police, okay, but we all recognize that's a profoundly true book. I view the Torah as the same way. I used to view it, the sort of mathematical logic way, but just for me, trying to come up with a lot of these ideas based off of where I thought the evidence led, eventually there was almost no choice. So you're right, something is lost. And obviously, the guy that's getting up at 6 a.m. every day in the winter to, go daven with a minion, before work, it's going to be a lot harder for that person to wake up with the Torah is a good piece of literature worldview as opposed to the Torah is true literature. I just think that it just almost was a necessary move. I said a lot, so
I listen. I definitely understand it, and if you're convinced by, I don't necessarily want to go in. I would say I'm less convinced by biblical criticism than the average person who studies academia. But once again, I wouldn't comment. I would. The only comments I would make on that are like very technical points of like logic, and not points as far as like what biblical critics actually like to talk about. Um, I'll bring it up as an example of like where logic and philosophy can kind of intersect with this, keeping in mind it is not my subject matter expertise, and it could be that religious critics have a religious critical way or textual critical way of dealing with this question. But as a philosopher, I've found that the claim of biblical criticism just very unfalsifiable, in that assume the claim of biblical criticism is true. I think you would need a very active redactor. I could not imagine an unactive redactor putting together something like Chumash. I could imagine an unactive redactor putting together the Gospels. Right, you're just stapling 4 different works together. No one had to edit them. But to put Chumash together, right, we clearly have things like the story of Noah, where we have things like the Genesis story, right, where it looks stapled together, and then we have things where Noah, where if you take the classical, J versus E approach, you end up with the story kind of cut and pasted apart, kind of different, in which case you would need an active redactor to do that. And the problem is that if there is an active redactor, I don't think you can reconstruct the original text, just because there'll be enough changes caused by the redactor in order to do it. And therefore, if biblical criticism is true, it would be impossible to reconstruct any of the original texts. So if someone presents to me ideas regarding the original text of biblical criticism, the original once again, there is a little bit of literature dealing with this as far as like different oral traditions, whatever, but you lose a lot of the potency of biblical criticism when coming from this perspective. My point is not to debate biblical criticism.
yeah. I think this can take us on a whole tangent, so I
Right.
won't. I'm very inclined to respond, but I won't. So I guess so. We've been talking for a little over an hour. I'm curious, is there anything we haven't hit yet? Any other, topics or offshoots of this that you think just interesting to address?
So there is one other larger, like my probabilistic argument is kind of like one of my bigger ones. My other one, just where I see people make mistakes about arguments a lot, and I don't think we have the time to get into this pretty long, is not understanding how a proof by contradiction works. And I found arguments where, it sounds like assume something is true, then it's true, when really what it's saying is you can't make a proof by contradiction.
Can
Um,
you give me an
there-
example of what a proof by
yeah, I'm trying
contradiction
to
is?
think off the top of my head of like, yeah, I'll give you an example. Just argument about the Gospels I actually heard this morning, um, involving Professor Bart Ehrman, who's Dr. Bart Ehrman, who's a philosopher of the New Testament who does a lot of talking with atheists. He likes to talk with atheists a lot about things and with religious people a lot about things. And he was, an evangelical who ended up becoming an academic liberal. And I'm using the term liberal there as in the technical sense, not in the political sense. And somebody was trying to argue to him that if the gospel story is true, in the gospel story, you have the idea that Pontius Pilate is kind of a reluctant to kill, to convict Jesus of the crimes, and that Jesus might be kind of different or unique in some kind of way, and therefore maybe Jesus was buried as opposed to just being hung on the cross and left to die on the cross. And that's where you get the idea that there was a tomb and therefore an empty tomb might lead to some historical evidence of the resurrection. So someone pointed out that if you take the Christian perspective of Jesus was kind of unique, proclaiming to be king of the Jews, and like he was Pontius was reluctant, and according to the later gospels, it was really kind of like the Jews were pressuring Pontius to make this decision. It would make sense why Pontius would then treat Jesus differently and have him taken down from the cross and put in a tomb. The response to that was, wait, so if the gospel authors are true, then the gospel authors are true. But that wasn't the claim. It's a little more subtle than that, which is that you're trying to claim a proof by contradiction. That if the gospel authors are true, if the gospel accounts are true, i.e., the Jews, egging on Pontius Pilate and all that, that there'd be no reason to bury Jesus and you could leave him on the cross. And the truth of that statement is that no, in the perspective of the gospels, everything is consistent. So sometimes
Well,
people
this is
don't.
almost the problem. I mean, not to go back to the
Yeah.
Orthodox Jew, this is the problem with the argument for mass revelation or the Kuzari principle, because the idea is, well, how can there have been mass revelation, with a bunch of people, somebody would have, called foul on this. And the question is, well, how do we know there's mass revelation? Because it's in the book that was mass revealed. And so it is circular in that sense also, right? I can also write a
Right.
book.
You run into this problem. So arguing, but I think even those who have a problem with it wouldn't claim that mass revelation is internally inconsistent. And I think sometimes people are trying to prove internal conflate, right? One way that I can disprove something is I assume it, and then I'm able to derive from the assumption a contradiction. Therefore, the original assumption was false. It's proof by contradiction, very classic style of logical proof. And I can respond to that by saying, no, if you assume it, I can avoid the contradiction, which sounds like what I'm saying is if what I assume is true, then what I assume is true. But it's not. It's saying something more subtle. If what I assume is true, you don't have this particular disproof that exists. Once again, that's a longer discussion. There is some literature
Sure.
about this, but
Yeah.
it's my point is that
I
these
think in
philosophical.
summarizing, I mean, just to highlight something that I've, felt for a while, which, is sad that it's true, but I think it is true, which is the vast majority of people go through thinking about things very shallowly and not with any type of rigor, whether we're talking about politics or social norms or religion or any of these things. The vast majority of people are not really delving into, a whole set of critical analyses based off of, rigorous tools of thinking about it, and are just kind of, I don't know, some mix of confirmation bias and people just repeating what they're told or whatever sort of in vogue that day. I mean, I think there's so many different areas that this is true. Certainly politics. I mean, certainly the way that people feel, I don't know, even something I talk about a lot, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just all of these things. People are very bad at being able to actually weigh evidence and again come up with probabilistic, intervals, both based off of, I think it's also true, not just for absolute truths of, is Israel generally in the right or are the Palestinians generally in the right? Okay, probabilistically, but even for individual things, right? Something can be 80% moral and 20% immoral. And, if you say that, oh, X, Y, and Z Israeli bombing of Lebanon was 70% moral and 30% immoral, right? That seems to upset everybody because the people that want to defend Israel at all costs will say, well, whoa, why are you, saying that there was a little bit of immorality to this? And the people that are sort of the rabid anti-Israelers are going to say, well, even you're admitting that it's immoral. So why aren't you condemning Israel? And it's like, all right, well, the world is a little bit more complicated than that. And sort of everything you sort of have to view through this, you know, probability or, different, I like to think of it as, especially when we're talking about moral or political arguments, different tensions of, okay, you have the tension of, you know, Israel not wanting to harm civilians, and you also have the tension of Israel needing to protect itself against hostile enemies. And so, in each action that Israel does, how are they balancing these tensions? And sometimes you think the balance is off, and sometimes it's, I don't mean to drag you into geopolitics here, but just, this is a topic I've been thinking about a lot. I'm curious if you have any just final thoughts either on what I just said or just in general.
So regarding what you just said, I can imagine a lot of things I've spoken about vis-a-vis, even your idea of using like tensions and modeling those kind of tensions with probabilistic arguments could give people more nuanced perspectives on things vis-a-vis geopolitical situation in the Middle East right now. Definitely could be done. It's not something I've thought seriously about. But yeah, I think your point is that people should take these conversations seriously. Being exposed to the tools of logic and understanding how formal reasoning works allows people to have a better idea of what they're believing in. Like people have beliefs and claims and think things, and being able to better understand those things, I think, is definitely a good thing, both from the secular humanist perspective and from an Orthodox Jewish perspective. People should just be as thought
I
out
mean,
as they can be in their opinions.
yes, not something I will disagree with. Jake, thank you so much for talking.
Thank you, Rabbi Levine.